There was a receipt on the evidence table. It was for $312.48. That was what Marcus Ellery paid for one vial of insulin on a Tuesday morning in September. One vial. The same vial that had cost him $78 the Friday before. The receipt was printed on thin thermal paper, and the edges had started to curl. I kept looking at it throughout the trial. That receipt is why I am talking to you today. Let me tell you how we got to that moment. I have presided over a lot of cases in my time on the bench. Drug cases, fraud cases, cases where someone died and we had to figure out what the law was willing to call that death. This was different, not because the facts were more extreme than anything I had seen before, but because of what sat underneath the facts, because of what the facts revealed about what we have quietly agreed to allow. I decided, some time ago, that staying quiet about it was not something I was willing to keep doing. So here we are. If you want to hear the rest of this, and I think you should, subscribe and turn on notifications. I am not saying that for the numbers. I am saying it because this story deserves more ears than it has gotten. Hit subscribe, then let me continue. The defendant's name was Gregory Hatch. He was 44 years old, CEO of a mid-sized pharmaceutical company called Virata Health, incorporated in Delaware, with operations out of Nashville, Tennessee. I want to tell you how he looked when he walked into my courtroom, but I am going to start with what he did before he got there because the way he walked in made more sense once I understood the kind of man he was. In the last week of August, Gregory Hatch approved a pricing directive for one of Virata Health's primary insulin products, a slow-acting formulation called Verisul. It had been on the market for 11 years. It was not a new drug. There was no new research behind it, no new manufacturing process, no supply disruption that cost more money to resolve. The directive raised the per-unit retail price from $78 to $312, 400%, effective immediately. No advance notice to pharmacies, no letter to patients, no press release, just a number in a system changed on a Thursday afternoon, which became visible to the world on a Friday morning when pharmacists across 6 states started getting calls they did not know how to answer. I want to be specific about who Marcus Ellery was, because I think it matters in a way that case documents could not fully capture. He was 31 years old when he came into my courtroom. He had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 7. He had been on Verisul specifically for 4 years because 2 other formulations had caused complications for him. He worked at an auto repair shop in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He made about $34,000 a year. He had insurance through his employer, but the plan had a high deductible structure, which meant that for 3 months out of every year, he was paying out of pocket for his medication while the deductible reset. September was one of those months. I noticed when he walked into the courtroom that he moved carefully, not slowly, carefully, like someone who has learned to manage his energy over a long period of time because he knows what it costs to spend it recklessly. He sat down and folded his hands on the table in front of him. He did not look around the room. When I finally heard him speak during testimony, what I noticed was that he said exactly what he meant. There was no extra language. He said, "I didn't go to work on the Monday. I didn't have enough insulin to safely go to work, and I couldn't afford to buy more." He said that plainly, like it was a logistics problem he had solved with the only solution available to him, which was to sit at home and wait. That sentence stayed with me longer than almost anything else I heard in that courtroom. Now Gregory Hatch. He came in wearing a charcoal suit. That detail matters less than what he did when he sat down. He sat down and looked at his legal team first, then at me, and there was a kind of assessment in it, the kind of look that comes from a lifetime of entering rooms and quickly deciding whether the people in them are a problem or not. I watched him scan the room and decide that everything was manageable. I noted that without judgment. Then I watched what happened to that assessment over the course of 3 days. On the second day, his co-counsel was handing him a document to review. He was reading it, and he thought the camera was on someone else, and he smiled. Not at anyone, just at the document. A small private smile. It was gone in under a second. But I was looking directly at him from the bench, and I saw it. I wrote it down. Before I go further, I need you to subscribe, not as a formality. Because there is one piece of evidence in this case, something small, something easy to overlook, that changed the entire direction of my ruling. I want to make sure you are here when I get to it. Subscribe now. Let me reconstruct what happened on the morning of September 6th, because the case built itself around that day. Marcus Ellery woke up at approximately 6:15 in the morning. He checked his remaining insulin supply. He had 3/4 of a vial left. He had been rationing for 2 days. His pharmacy was a CVS on South Rutherford Boulevard, about 4 miles from his apartment. He drove there at approximately 7:45 a.m. The pharmacist on duty that morning was a woman named Deborah Kincaid, who later testified that she had spent the first 45 minutes of her shift fielding calls and questions about the price change. She said the calls were, and I am using her word, disorienting, because nobody could explain them. The system just showed a new number. Marcus Ellery handed his prescription to the counter. The pharmacist ran it through. The register returned a patient responsibility of $312.48. Deborah Kincaid said she told him she was sorry. She ran it twice. He stood at the counter for a moment without speaking. He had $117 in his checking account. He drove home. He rationed what he had left. He stretched 3/4 of a vial across 5 days by reducing his dosing below the prescribed level. His blood sugar became unstable. On the 4th day, a Saturday, he was found unresponsive in his apartment by a neighbor who had been asked to check on him. He was transported by ambulance to St. Thomas Rutherford Hospital. He spent 41 hours in the ICU. The bill for that hospitalization was $11,820. Gregory Hatch, when asked in his deposition why the price change had been made without any patient notification period, said, "Notification timelines are a courtesy, not a contractual requirement. We fulfilled our legal obligations." I wrote that down too. The case came to me as a civil action under Tennessee Consumer Protection statutes, combined with a state attorney general complaint and a federal referral related to deceptive trade practices. What made this case procedurally unusual is that it carried a provision allowing the court to impose equitable relief alongside civil penalties. That means I could order something beyond a fine. I could order remedies designed to be corrective, not just punitive. Most people outside the legal system do not know that distinction exists. It matters here enormously. The moment the combined complaint landed on my desk, I read it twice. Then I read the pricing directive submitted in evidence. There was a memo attached, an internal memo, dated 3 weeks before the price change, with Gregory Hatch's name in the signature line. The memo discussed what it called price elasticity modeling for Verisul in markets with high uninsured and underinsured populations. The language was specific about who the company believed would be most affected, and it was specific in a way that was not accidental. I want to stop here for a moment, because what I am about to tell you is the part of this case that I had to sit with the longest before I felt ready to speak about it publicly. Subscribe before we go further, then take a breath, because this next part matters. The evidence came in 3 phases, and I experienced them the way you experience any case when you are paying close attention. The first phase established the baseline, the pricing directive, the timing, the financial record showing the price change taking effect across retail channels in 6 states between 11:42 p.m. on Thursday, September 4th, and 6:00 a.m. on Friday, September 5th. Marcus Ellery's medical records, his bank record showing the $117, the ambulance dispatch record, the 41 hours in the ICU. That phase alone told a clear enough story, but a clear story is not always a complete one. The second phase was where it became more serious, not less. The plaintiff's attorneys introduced internal communications, 11 emails and the memo I mentioned. What the emails showed was a deliberate conversation spanning 18 days about how to implement the price change in a way that minimized what the company called public response latency. That phrase means how long before the public notices and reacts. And the strategy they chose, the one Hatch signed off on, was to implement the change overnight on a Thursday because, as one email put it, weekend news cycles have lower pickup rates and consumer advocacy organizations have reduced staff on Fridays. I watched Marcus Ellery listen as those emails were read into evidence. He looked at his hands. After a moment he looked up at the ceiling. He did not make a sound. I have seen people cry in my courtroom many times. I have seen people go very quiet in a way that is harder to watch than crying. He was doing the second one. The third wave was the piece I told you I would come back to. Here it is. The defense had argued consistently that the price change was a market correction, a realignment with competitor pricing. The word correction was used 14 times across 2 days of testimony. It was used with confidence, as though it were a neutral word. What the defense had not anticipated was Virata Health's own quarterly earnings call transcript from 6 weeks earlier. The plaintiff's attorneys had pulled it. In that call, Gregory Hatch had told investors that Verisil was, and I am reading directly from the transcript, significantly underpriced relative to the dependency profile of our patient base. The dependency profile of the patient base. He was not talking about market correction. He was talking about the fact that the people who needed this drug could not stop needing it, and he was identifying that as an opportunity. That transcript was introduced on the morning of the third day. I watched Gregory Hatch's face when it was read aloud. He looked at his attorney. His attorney did not look back at him. That was the moment I saw the assessment leave his expression entirely. I have been on this bench for 23 years. I have seen a lot of cases. The ones I choose to talk about publicly are the ones I believe need more people to know about. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what is hitting you hardest so far. I read what people write. It matters to me. The defense made 4 principal arguments, and I want to be fair to them because the law requires me to be, and because I believe in being fair, regardless of what the law requires. First, that the pricing change was within the legal boundaries of pharmaceutical pricing practice in Tennessee. This was accurate, it was legal. That was not, as I would later explain, the only relevant standard. Second, that Marcus Ellery's hospitalization resulted from his own decision to reduce his dosing without medical consultation. I considered this carefully. A person could theoretically have called a doctor and explored options. But this argument ignored the financial reality, the limited time window Marcus Ellery had before his supply ran out, and the fact that it essentially asked a patient to solve in 4 days a problem the company created in one night. Third, that no disclosure or notification law had been violated, because no such law specifically covered overnight retail pricing changes in this context. Also accurate. Also not the complete picture. Fourth, that Gregory Hatch personally had no knowledge of how the pricing change would affect specific individual patients. This argument failed most completely when measured against the evidence because the internal memo showed the company had explicitly modeled the effect on patients with limited coverage and high out-of-pocket exposure. Hatch himself, during testimony, said, "I rely on my team to manage the analytics. I approved the directive based on the summary conclusions." I wrote that down. I approved the directive based on the summary conclusions. There is a kind of sentence that tells you more than the person saying it understands. That was one of them. I am going to tell you something about this case that is not from the file. When I was in my second year of law school, my mother was diagnosed with a condition that required ongoing medication. I will not name the condition. But I remember sitting at her kitchen table in the spring of 1987, and she had a yellow notepad and she was doing math on it, figuring out which bills she could delay, figuring out whether there was a way to afford what she needed for the month. She was not dramatic about it. She was just doing the math. I sat across from her and watched her work the numbers and felt the specific helplessness of caring about someone and being unable to change the constraint they are working inside of. I did not tell the jury about my mother. I told my wife one evening during the trial, and then I went back to work. I am telling you now because it is part of why this case is the one I chose to speak about first. On the morning I delivered the verdict, the courtroom was quiet before I entered. I could hear it through the door. Not silence in the sense of no sound, silence in the sense of held breath. I had been on the bench long enough to know what different kinds of quiet feel like in a room. This was the kind that comes from people genuinely uncertain about what is about to happen. I had made my decision. I had made it 4 days earlier, if I am honest, but the moment still lands differently when it is spoken out loud. You can know a thing completely and still feel the weight of saying it in a room full of people who will leave and carry it with them. I found in favor of the plaintiff on all 4 primary claims. I found Gregory Hatch liable in his individual capacity as the authorizing officer of the pricing directive. I found Virata Health liable as the corporate entity. Then I moved to remedies. The verdict was not the hardest part of this case for me, the sentencing was. Because sentencing, under equitable relief provisions, is where I had to decide not just what was legal but what was right. Subscribe so you do not miss what I decided. I am getting to it now. I am ordering you to pay a civil fine of $14 million, not to a general fund, to the Tennessee Healthcare Access Trust, a state fund that provides emergency medication assistance to uninsured and underinsured patients. $14 million because that is what the plaintiff's economic analysis calculated as the total projected excess revenue Virata Health would have earned from the pricing change over 12 months across the 6 affected states. The money that was built on the dependency profile of people who could not stop needing the drug will now go to the people who need medication and cannot afford it. I am also ordering the suspension of Gregory Hatch's executive licensing authorization in the state of Tennessee for a period of 5 years. He cannot serve as chief executive, chief operating officer, or board chair of any pharmaceutical, healthcare, or medical supply company with operations in this state during that period. 5 years. Not permanently. I am not in the business of permanent destruction. But 5 years is long enough to sit with what he did without the authority to do it to someone else. I am ordering 400 hours of community service, not general community service. Specifically, 400 hours at free community health clinics in Davidson, Rutherford, and Shelby counties in a patient-facing support capacity. He will sit across from the people who are doing the math that my mother did. I am also ordering a written public apology specifically addressed to patients affected by the Verisol pricing directive, published in full in 3 major Tennessee newspapers and posted permanently on Virata Health's corporate website. The statement must be written by Gregory Hatch himself, not his communications team. It will be submitted to the court for approval before publication to ensure it contains no language that functions as justification or qualification. And then there is one more thing. Marcus Ellery's hospital bill, $11,820. Gregory Hatch will pay it, in full, personally, not through Virata Health, not through insurance. Gregory Hatch will write a check to St. Thomas Rutherford Hospital for $11,820. He will also fund 3 years of Marcus Ellery's Verisol prescription at the pre-directive price of $78 per vial. I looked at Gregory Hatch when I finished, and I said this to him directly, and I am going to say it again now. What you did was not illegal. I want to be precise about that. You found the space between what is illegal and what is harmful, and you operated there deliberately. You used language in your internal communications that made the harm a variable in a calculation. You looked at the fact that people cannot stop needing medication to survive and described that fact as a pricing opportunity. You approved a directive that you knew, based on your own company's modeling, would land hardest on people already stretched the most thin. Your family is not responsible for what you did. I know there are people in your life who did not sit in that memo meeting. I am not making a statement about them. I am making a statement about you. You have resources, real resources, the kind that carry real responsibilities, not moral abstractions, specific material responsibilities to the people whose lives your decisions touch. You were given authority over something that people cannot live without. That is not a metaphor. That is a clinical fact, and you treated it as leverage. You will do what this court has ordered. And after that, what kind of person you choose to be is a question only you can answer. There are other cases I want to talk about. This is not the only one that stayed with me. Subscribe and you will hear them when I am ready to tell them. I sat on the bench after the ruling, the way I always do, until the room began to clear. I watch how people leave. Gregory Hatch stood up, adjusted his jacket, leaned close to his attorney, and said something brief. His attorney nodded. They walked out together and were already in conversation about what came next. Marcus Ellery sat for a moment after the ruling. His attorney, Sylvia Crane, put a hand briefly on his shoulder. He nodded once. Then he stood up slowly, walked toward the back of the courtroom, and a woman I took to be a family member met him near the door. She put her arms around him, and he stood in that embrace for a long moment and did not move. The room, as I finally stood up from the bench, felt lighter than it had when the morning started. That is not drama. That is just what I noticed. The appeal was filed by Virata Health 43 days after the ruling. The Sixth Circuit heard it. The appellate panel upheld the ruling in full on 6 of 7 claims and remanded one narrow issue related to the fine calculation back to my court, where I reaffirmed it with additional documentation. The process took 11 months. I was not surprised by the appeal. I was relieved by the outcome. On March 14th of the following year, I received a letter, not addressed to the court, addressed to me personally at the courthouse. It was from Marcus Ellery. He had gone back to work at the auto repair shop. His blood sugar had been stable for 4 months. He said he did not need anything from me. He wrote the letter because he thought I might want to know that he was okay. He used those exact words. I put the letter in a folder in my desk. I still have it. Gregory Hatch completed the 400 hours. A clinic coordinator in Memphis confirmed it when I made an inquiry in the spring. She said he was quiet when he came in, that he mostly helped with paperwork and transportation coordination for patients. She said that by the end, some of the regular patients knew him by name. I do not know what to do with that information. I do not think I am supposed to do anything with it. I am just telling you what I was told. There is a question this case left me with that I have not answered, not fully. What do we owe each other when the thing one person holds is the thing another person cannot live without? I have thought about it from a legal frame and a moral frame and a practical frame, and none of those frames closes the question entirely. The law can say what is illegal. The law cannot always say what is wrong. Those two things are not always the same, and the space between them is very large, and people live in it and sometimes die in it. What I do know is this: the memo existed, the strategy was deliberate, the harm was foreseeable. And when we design systems that allow someone to treat survivability as a market variable, we are all, in some partial way, operating under a directive we may not have signed but have not yet stopped either. To the people who are doing the math that Marcus Ellery was doing, the math my mother was doing, the math I know some of you are doing right now, I see you. Not as a category, not as an underinsured population, as people doing a specific kind of math that you should not have to do, under a constraint placed on you by a decision someone made who knew exactly what they were doing. Your situation was not invisible in that courtroom. To the people who sit where Gregory Hatch sat, who have the authority to set numbers that other people have no choice but to meet, I am not asking you to be selfless. I am asking you one question. When you look at the modeling, when you see the dependency profile, when the spreadsheet tells you the leverage exists, what do you do in that moment before you sign? That moment is the one I am thinking about. That is the one where the whole thing is still a choice. There are organizations working on pharmaceutical access and pricing transparency right now that could use the weight of your position. You could find them in an afternoon if you decided to look. The receipt on the evidence table was printed on thin thermal paper and the edges had curled. $312.48, one vial, one Tuesday morning. One man standing at a pharmacy counter in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, doing math that he could not make work. That is why I told you this story. If you want to hear the others, and there are others, subscribe. That is all I am asking. Subscribe and stay. The comment section is where people who care about the same things find each other. Say something if this landed with you. I read what you leave there.